It started with a loud crash, the kind that makes everyone in a restaurant go silent for a second. Plates shattered, and an awkward hush swept through the air. People turned toward the commotion near the dessert counter, where a man in an expensive-looking suit was glaring down at a young employee. His voice was sharp and biting. "Do you even know how to do your job?" he snapped, his tone dripping with condescension. "That's the second time you've brought the wrong order. What's the point of even hiring you?" The young employee, whose name tag read David, looked flustered, clutching a small tray of desserts as if it was a lifeline. He had Down syndrome, and though his expression was calm, there was an undeniable sadness in his eyes. You could see he was trying his best to keep his composure, even as this customer laid into him. Some people in the restaurant exchanged awkward glances, but no one said anything. That's the thing about moments like this, people freeze. No one wants to be the one to step in the far corner of the room. A man wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses lowered his menu, just enough to glance at the scene unfolding. He'd been quietly enjoying his coffee, unnoticed in the busy lunch crowd, but now his sharp gaze followed every word and movement of the altercation. The man with the hat was none other than Tom Cruise. Yes, that Tom Cruise. He had slipped into the restaurant earlier that afternoon, hoping for a peaceful meal before heading to a nearby set. But now, his quiet afternoon had taken a turn. The customer, whom I'll call Mr. Business Suit, was relentless. "You know what?" he sneered, standing up and waving a hand toward David like he was shooing away a fly. "Give me someone who can actually do their job. Someone who has the capacity to understand basic instructions. Clearly, you're not it." David, bless him, didn't say a word. He nodded politely and started to walk away, but his hands were shaking so much that one of the desserts teetered off the tray and fell to the ground with a splatter. "Oh, for God's sake!" Mr. Business Suit threw his hands in the air. "You can't even do that right. Do you have any idea how much the suit costs? I shouldn't have to deal with this level of incompetence." Tom's jaw tightened. He stood up, slowly and deliberately, but no one noticed him yet. The restaurant manager appeared, rushing over to defuse the situation. "Sir, I'm so sorry for the inconvenience," she said, her tone apologetic. "David's new, and we're still training him." "I don't care if he's new," Mr. Business Suit snapped. "If you're going to hire people like him, at least make sure they don't ruin a customer's experience." David was wiping the spilled dessert off the floor, his back hunched as though he was trying to make himself invisible. The whole scene was hard to watch, and yet, still, no one stepped in. Tom took a step closer. Tom's stride was calm, measured, but there was a fire in his eyes. It was the kind of quiet intensity he's known for in his movies, but here it was real, and the energy in the restaurant seemed to shift as he approached the scene. "Hey," Tom said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. It wasn't loud, but it was commanding enough to make Mr. Business Suit stop mid-rant and turn toward him. "I think that's enough." Mr. Business Suit blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Tom said, his tone steady but firm. "That's enough." At first, it seemed like Mr. Business Suit didn't recognize who was speaking to him. He looked Tom up and down, taking in the baseball cap, the casual leather jacket, the no-nonsense stance. "And who exactly do you think you are?" he said, his voice laced with irritation. Tom tilted his head slightly, a small, almost imperceptible smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Someone who doesn't like bullies." By now, the whole restaurant had gone completely silent. Every single person was watching, some leaning forward in their seats, others whispering to their companions. A few people were pulling out their phones, but it was clear they were hesitant to film too blatantly. Mr. Business Suit let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Look, buddy," he said, "this is none of your business. I'm just trying to get decent service in this dump. If you're some kind of hero wannabe, save it for someone who cares." Tom took another step forward, and though he wasn't much taller than the other man, he had an undeniable presence that made him seem 100 feet tall in that moment. "It's not about being a hero," Tom said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "It's about respect. That kid," he gestured toward David, who was still crouched on the floor, picking up the last bits of the spilled dessert, "is working his tail off, and you're tearing him down like it's your right." "It's not. You're lecturing me about respect?" Mr. Business Suit scoffed. "Give me a break. You don't even know me." "You're right," Tom said, nodding slightly. I don't know you, but I know the kind of person who thinks they can talk to someone like that just because they're having a bad day or they think their suit makes them special. And let me tell you something. Your suit doesn't make you special. How you treat people does. The crowd murmured in agreement, and a few people even started clapping softly. That be why now, Mr. Business Suit's face was turning red. Oh, I get it, he sneered. You're trying to play the good guy in front of an audience. Well, newsflash, pal. Nobody cares what you think. Tom raised an eyebrow. Funny. They seemed to care. He gestured to the crowd of onlookers, many of whom were now openly recording the interaction, but that's when it hit Mr. Business Suit. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the raised phones and the collective judgment in the faces of the diners. His bluster faltered for a moment, but he quickly covered it up with another wave of arrogance. You know what, he said, grabbing his briefcase from the chair. This place isn't worth my time, and neither are you. With that, he stormed out of the restaurant, muttering under his breath, as the door swung shut behind him. The room erupted into applause. Tom didn't bask in the moment, though. Instead, he crouched down next to David, who was still on the floor, his hands trembling as he tried to finish cleaning up the mess. Hey, Tom said gently, placing a hand on David's shoulder. You doing okay? David looked up, his eyes wide with a mix of surprise and gratitude. I'm okay, he said softly. Tom gave him a warm smile. You're doing great, man. Don't let guys like that get to you, okay? They're not worth it. David nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The applause in the restaurant didn't die down for a while, and a few people even came up to pat David on the back or thank Tom for stepping in. Tom, being Tom, didn't bask in the attention for long. He simply gave a small wave and motioned for the manager to come over. The manager, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and an apologetic smile, rushed over. I'm so sorry for the scene, she said to Tom. And, David, I should have stepped in sooner. No need to apologize, Tom interrupted gently, waving it off. But I think we can all agree that David's doing an amazing job. Right? The crowd, still listening in, murmured their agreement. David's face lit up with a shy smile, and he stood up, holding his tray a little higher now. Thanks, he said softly, his voice barely audible over the hum of chatter that had resumed in the restaurant. Tom crouched down again to meet David's eye level. Hey, I mean it. You're doing awesome. And if anyone ever tries to tell you otherwise, you just remember that their opinion doesn't matter. Okay? You're way stronger than you think. David nodded, his confidence growing with each word. Before Tom could return to his table, a young girl, no more than 10 years old, approached him timidly. She was clutching a notebook in one hand and a pen in the other. Her mother stood a few feet away, watching nervously. Excuse me, are you? The girl trailed off, clearly intimidated. Tom smiled warmly. Yep, it's me, he said, lowering his sunglasses just enough for her to see his eyes. What's your name? Sophie, she said, her cheeks turning pink. Well, Sophie, would you like me to sign that for you? Tom gestured to the notebook. She nodded eagerly, and as Tom took the notebook, she whispered, That was really cool, what you did for him. Tom paused mid-signature and glanced at Sophie, his expression softening. Thanks, Sophie. That means a lot. But you know what? It's not just about doing something cool. It's about doing what's right. Think you can remember that? Sophie nodded earnestly. As Tom handed the notebook back to her. David spoke up from behind him. Mr. Cruz? Tom turned, surprised to hear David's voice. Yeah, buddy? David fidgeted with the edge of his apron. Thanks for sticking up for me. Most people just watch. Tom's smile grew, and he placed a hand on David's shoulder again. Hey, it's what anyone should do. And you don't need me to stick up for you. You're strong enough to handle anything. I just gave that guy a reminder of what really matters. At that moment, a server passed by with a tray full of drinks, and Tom flagged her down. Could you bring my check, please? The manager interjected quickly, shaking her head. Oh, no. Your meal is on the house. It's the least we can do. Tom chuckled. I appreciate it, but that's not necessary. I can't take advantage of your kindness. The manager insisted, but Tom reached into his pocket, pulled out a couple of crisp bills, and handed them to her. Then consider it a tip for the team, he said with a wink. As the commotion began to settle, one of the restaurant's other regulars, an elderly man who had been quietly watching the whole ordeal, stood up and raised his coffee cup in Tom's direction. "To good people," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "To good people," a few others echoed, lifting their glasses and cups. Tom nodded humbly, raising his own coffee cup before finally heading toward the door. But as he reached for the handle, David called out one more time, "Wait." Tom turned, and David hesitated for a moment before saying, "You're my favorite actor." The room chuckled softly, and Tom's face broke into a wide grin. "Thanks, David. That means the world to me. Keep being awesome, okay?" David nodded, his face beaming with pride. Then as Tom walked out of the restaurant, the chatter of the diners slowly returned to normal. But there was a new kind of energy in the air. People seemed lighter, kinder, as if witnessing that one moment of courage and compassion had reminded them all of something important. But the story wasn't quite over as Tom stepped out into the sunny afternoon. He slid his sunglasses back on and took a deep breath. He had done what he came to do, stick up for someone who needed it, and now it was time to move on with his day. But what he didn't realize was that the ripple effects of his actions were just beginning. Inside the restaurant, people were still talking about what had just happened. A group of teenagers at a nearby table, who had been glued to their phones during most of lunch, suddenly found themselves deep in conversation. "Man, I didn't even know that guy was Tom Cruise at first," one of them said, shaking his head. "But did you see how he handled that jerk? That was insane." Yet another chimed in. "It makes you think, like, would we have just sat here if he hadn't said anything?" The teens glanced around at the other diners, a subtle sense of shame flickering across their faces. Meanwhile, David had been pulled aside by the restaurant manager, who gave him a heartfelt pep talk. "Listen, David," she said, her voice firm but kind. "You're one of the hardest workers we've got here, and don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. If a customer ever talks to you like that again, you come straight to me, okay?" David nodded, his confidence growing with every word. He wasn't used to being the center of attention like this, but for the first time, it felt good. But the biggest surprise came about 20 minutes later when a man in a plain button-down shirt walked into the restaurant, looking slightly nervous. It was Mr. Business Suit. The room went quiet again as people recognized him, and a few muttered under their breath. David, who had been wiping down a table near the door, froze when he saw him. Mr. Business Suit hesitated for a moment, then walked straight over to David. "Hey, David, right?" he said, his voice lower and less confident than before. David nodded cautiously, unsure of what was coming next. I wanted to apologize," Mr. Business Suit said, scratching the back of his neck. "I was out of line earlier. You didn't deserve that." The restaurant was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. David blinked, clearly surprised. "Oh, okay," he said softly. "I mean it," Mr. Business Suit continued. "I shouldn't have taken my frustrations out on you. That was wrong of me. So, I'm sorry." David nodded again, this time with a small smile. "Thanks," he said simply. The man gave him an awkward nod before turning to leave. But before he could reach the door, the elderly regular who had toasted to good people earlier called out, "Hey." Mr. Business Suit stopped and turned, his face slightly pale. "Apologizing's a good start," the old man said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Now do something better next time. Don't just talk about it. Be better." The man gave a quick nod, muttered something under his breath, and left. Back in the kitchen, one of the servers leaned against the counter and shook her head. "I can't believe what just happened," she said to the others. "It's like the guy had a complete change of heart. Guess Tom Cruise can do more than just jump out of planes," another server joked, earning a round of laughter. David, meanwhile, was still processing everything. He wasn't used to getting so much attention, positive or negative, but something about the way people had rallied around him made him feel stronger than he had in a long time. That'd be why the end of his shift, David was still floating on a strange mix of nerves and pride. The day had been unlike any other. When he clocked out, he found himself taking his time walking home, replaying everything that had happened in his mind. But he thought about Tom Cruise, the way he had stood up for him, the way he spoke with so much confidence. David had never had someone defend him like that before. It felt empowering. When he got home, his mom was waiting for him in the kitchen, as she always did after his shifts. "Hey, sweetheart," she said brightly. "How was work today?" David set his bag down and shrugged. "It was good. Weird, but good." His mom raised an eyebrow. "Weird how?" He hesitated, unsure of where to begin. Well, Tom Cruise came to the restaurant. His mom froze mid-stir of the spaghetti sauce. Wait, what? The actor? That Tom Cruise. David nodded. Yeah, he helped me out. What do you mean? She asked, setting the spoon down and giving him her full attention. David took a deep breath and told her the whole story. The rude customer, the yelling, how Tom had stood up for him, and how everyone in the restaurant had clapped and cheered. His mom listened intently, her eyes welling up with pride. David, she said softly, putting a hand on his cheek. You've always been amazing, but hearing how you handled all that, I'm so proud of you. David smiled, his heart swelling at her words. The next morning, David walked into the restaurant for his shift, and everything felt different. The staff greeted him with big smiles, and even the customers seemed unusually friendly. As he walked past the front counter, the manager pulled him aside. Hey, David, I wanted to show you something, she said, holding up her phone. She opened a video of the confrontation from the day before. Someone had recorded the whole thing and posted it online, and it had already gone viral. The clip started with Mr. Business Suit's rant and ended with Tom's calm but powerful takedown. The comments were filled with praise for both Tom and David. This makes me cry, one comment read. That young man handled himself with so much grace. Bravo to Tom Cruise for stepping in. David is a rock star, said another. We need more people like him in the world. David's jaw dropped as he scrolled through the comments. I don't know what to say, he stammered. You don't have to say anything, the manager said, grinning. Just keep being you. As the day went on, reporters began showing up at the restaurant, asking to speak to David. Customers came in asking for him by name, and some even left big tips with notes like, For David, thank you for inspiring us. By the end of the week, David had become something of a local celebrity. The story had been picked up by news outlets, and even Tom Cruise himself posted about it on his social media. Heroes come in all shapes and sizes, Tom wrote, alongside a photo of himself with David from the day of the incident. David reminded me, and everyone who was lucky enough to be there, that kindness and perseverance are what really matter. David couldn't believe it. All his life, people had underestimated him, judged him for things he couldn't control. But now, for the first time, the world was seeing him for who he really was, capable, kind, and strong. And as for Mr. Business Suit, word got around that he donated a significant amount of money to a local organization that supports people with disabilities. Whether it was guilt or a genuine change of heart, no one could say for sure. But one thing was clear. That day had left its mark on everyone. As David locked up the restaurant one evening, he looked out at the quiet street and smiled to himself. The world was still far from perfect, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. And who knows? Maybe Tom Cruise was right. Maybe he really could handle anything.